Good evening. Okay, I'm Councillor Higson, the Chairman of the Climate Transition Corporate and Environmental Services Policy Advisory Committee. I'm pleased to welcome you to this meeting. The meeting will be broadcast live and recorded for playback on the Council's YouTube channel. Will anyone else be recording the proceedings? I ask so that people at the meeting will know if this will be happening. With fire alarm sounds during the meeting, please remain seated and members of Democratic Services team will assess the situation and give further instructions on the evacuation of the building if necessary. So item 1, we've had apologies from Councillor Forecast. Are there any other apologies? No, as of yet. Councillor Jenkins-Baldock's not here. Yeah, okay, all right. Thank you. Item 2, substitute members. So there are no substitute members. There are no urgent items. Are there any visiting members? I can't see any, so no. Are there any disclosures by members or officers? Okay, Councillor Harper.
I'm a member of the Kent Wildlife Trust, but don't obviously have any pecuniary interest in it.
Thank you. Are there any disclosures of lobbying? No, thank you. So I move that all items be taken in public. Is that agreed? Thank you. Are there any comments? So item 8 in your pack. Are there any comments on the accuracy of the minutes of the last meeting? No, okay. In which case I move that the minutes of the meeting held on the 3rd of February 2026 be approved as a correct record and signed. Is that agreed? Thank you very much. So item 9 is the forward plan. Are there any comments on the forward plan from the committee? Do any cabinet members want to make any comments on the forward plan? Okay, thank you. In which case I move that the forward plan be noted. Is that agreed? Thank you very much. Right, so first main item is item 10, the Foundation Strategic Authority. This is going to be introduced by Councillor Jeffrey, the leader of the council.
Thank you very much. So a few weeks ago, I received a letter from the minister, whose name escapes me at this moment in time, inviting us to put an expression of interest in for a Foundation Strategic Authority for Kent. Obviously, the other 13 leaders received the same letter across the county. The foundation, and I wanted to bring it here, not because I've got any concerns about it, but purely to make sure that it's out in the public domain and that members get a chance to add comments and so forth in terms of what that expression of interest might look like. I'm hoping, as a council, we've already said we kind of want a strategic authority across Kent. We want the devolution bit along. You know, the unitary bit is a facilitator for the devolution bit. So I'm hoping that's moderately uncontentious. This FSA, which isn't Financial Services Authority, it's Foundation Strategic Authority, is kind of devolution light, so it won't have as many powers or as much power, and probably not as much money. It, in theory, will still cover the same range of competencies that the mayoral strategic authority might cover. It also is seen as a stepping stone to getting the mayoral strategic authority. So we've got, I think, about 3 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks to submit the expression of interest. There's going to be a discussion amongst Kent leaders in a week and a half's time, and as I say, I'm keen to get views and so forth. One thing we don't quite know is the exact mechanism, because there's potentially 2 mechanisms for this to happen, and we haven't got the detail in terms of the minister's view on the route for this to be delivered. It could be through the devolution bill, it could be through combined authority legislation. So we're still digging through that, but either way, it probably feels the right thing to do. Alison, what have I missed?
Thank you. So just to get a little bit of the technical context, you may recall that at the end of 2024, the government produced a white paper specifically covering devolution. In it, they expressed the aspiration for the whole of England in one way or another to have strategic authorities. And they identified a number of different levels. So the leader has described a foundation strategic authority maybe as devolution light or a stepping stone. I'd invite you to consider it as maybe a rung on a ladder, because the powers and responsibilities of an FSA are less than you would get with a mayoral or an established mayoral strategic authority. But those other types of authority, the responsibilities are cumulative, so they would build upon the foundation strategic authority provisions, if indeed the progression to those other types of strategic authority was to occur. Just a couple of other things to say. During the course of our consideration of local government reorganisation, there was debate, and I think emerging from that a sentiment that devolution was perhaps as important an outcome of the changes that we're going through at the moment as local government reorganisation itself. So in the reports that were written for the Cabinet and Council, that was reflected. So to take part in an expression of interest would be entirely consistent with the position that this council has taken before. And the appendix to the report shows you what the scope of an FSA would be. One of the key differences, though, between a foundation level strategic authority and the other mayoral authorities is not just the scope, but also the amount of resource that flows. So it is much less for an FSA than the other two. And there are not any revenue raising powers. So the cost of running an FSA falls to the existing local government person in an area. So I'm happy to take questions, provide clarification, and if that exceeds our knowledge at the moment, then we'll make that clear as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, Councillor Jenkins-Baldock, do you have any disclosures or any disclosure of lobbying? No, thank you. Right. Councillor Parfitt.
Thank you, Chairman. Probably, I think some of what I was going to ask has been answered by Alison, because I sort of had three questions, not that I would expect to be answered now, but that I would like us to be asking going forward. And one of those was, do we envisage any new money, or is it just going to be the existing money repackaged? So that was my question, but I think from what Alison said, that it is going to be the existing envelope. Is that right?
So I think there are two things that we need to consider: the money to run an FSA and the money that an FSA would spend. And for the latter, you're right, there would be redirected resources coming from various government departments to be spent under the control of a local strategic authority as opposed to a central government department.
Yeah. And the other points, I suppose, I was just sort of intrigued about is the democratic accountability, because obviously there's no mayor in charge, so how that would work. And would we effectively, because we're going down this path of reorganisation, are we going to find ourselves doing the same thing twice? Or is it going to be sort of an ongoing process that what we're doing now is going to provide the foundations for an FSA, or are we going to end up sort of reorganising twice? Thank you. That's all I have to say.
So no, absolutely understand your point. I don't think there's a second layer of reorganisation. I think this is a stepping stone. It's part of an evolution rather than a further revolution that's needed. And there was a first bit to your question, and I've just forgotten it. Oh, the democratic. So I think that's to be decided, is my understanding. If it's the combined authority model, then it's a representative from the constituent. Well, it would be top tier, but we're under the current CCA legislation. If they bring in new stuff in, and we're just checking the devolution bill, if there's new powers in there, then it could be including us. But they have written to us as a district borough, so one assumes that there will be something from each of the authorities.
Okay, just a couple of things to add. I think there are two ways in which you could do things twice. And I think what the leader has referred to is, do you create a strategic body more than once? I do think there's another angle to be aware of. So firstly, we need to be aware of the fact that potentially change for local government reorganisation and change for strategic authority they could happen in parallel, or they could happen sequentially. In order for things to happen in parallel, there'd have to be quite an acceleration of work for the strategic authority to be created. However, that would be quite beneficial in all the options that have been put forward by Kent, say for the single unitary, because there are things that need to be done at a strategic level across the whole of the Kent geography. And you'll see from the list of FSA responsibilities that lists out some of the things that are best done at that geography. So that's the first thing to say. So doing FSA and LGR at the same time would be demanding, but reduce the need perhaps to redo work. In any case, there is separate legislation that has been created that says that we have to produce a strategic spatial plan. And so we know we're going to have to do that anyway. So doing that at the same time as an FSA would make logical sense. Whether it's practically achievable is another matter. And then your question about democracy and accountability at work. So typically, combined authorities are comprised of people who have been elected to the constituent councils. So, for example, when that happened in Greater Manchester, the representatives were from the 10 unitary authorities. This was before the mayor's role was created, but things have developed since then. What the leader was referring to was, at the moment, we need to get clarity on who the constituent authorities are. If we took a snapshot today, it would be Medway and KCC. If we took a snapshot on the 1st of April 2028, it could be 1, 3, 4 or 5 unitary councils, hence why we're not able to give you a totally precise answer at the moment. And why there would be a lot to be worked out with the officials and the minister at MHCLG.
Thank you. Can I just ask, what is, I don't want to know or we shouldn't be told the details of any conversations, but have any conversations happened already? And what is the feeling of our partner authorities?
So amongst Kent councils, the 14 of us, there have been many conversations about devolution and strategic authorities all the time since we had the white paper. And although that debate has ebbed and flowed, I would say that there's been a pretty consistent sentiment across time and for each of the councils, which I'll come caveat in a moment, in support of devolution. Obviously, when political complexion changes, the opinion of an authority can also change. And certainly in the informal conversations that have been happening since we got the invitation to do the expression of interest, we've had reasonably clear position from 13 authorities, and I'd say probably a bit of a silence from the 14th.
Thank you very much. Councillor Harper.
Thank you. One of the things I wasn't clear is this foundation authority covering the whole of Kent and Medway or just Kent, because terminology seems to flow throughout the report, so it's not particularly clear as to whether we're looking at an authority just covering the area of Kent County Council or Kent and Medway Council. So that's my first point.
Yeah, my understanding is Kent and Medway.
Right, okay, thank you. Then my other points really pick up on what Lottie was saying, I think, and to some extent what Alison's been saying. We seem to be getting local government reorganisation, devolution, whatever you call it, coming out in a bit of a muddle. It all seemed to be clear at the beginning as to, you know, the landscape the government wanted to do. Now it realises it can't do mayors in time, and elections across the country are being delayed by a year or whatever for authorities further ahead in the process than we are. But the one thing we do know is that in a couple of months' time, once the consultation we're in the middle of at the moment finishes, the government's going to tell us what the geography is going to be for Kent and Medway. But at that time, we won't know whether there's going to be a foundation strategic authority or not. So as soon as we know what the geography is, the 14 authorities will presumably start work on moving towards these number of unitaries, as you say, it could be anywhere between 1 and 5, without a knowledge as to whether there's going to be a foundation authority or not. Now, the role and responsibilities of unitaries on their own, I don't think, unless you can correct me, does it cover everything Kent and Medway do? Because looking at what the Foundation Strategic Authority would be doing would have an element of responsibility around things like public transport. Now, public transport, it comes under, to some extent, under Kent County Council and Medway Unitary Authority now. And I'm just thinking, are we facing a situation, picking up to say Lottie's point again, where we reorganise into unitaries, 90% of the work done by all these authorities falls to the unitaries, well, there's 10% or whatever, it might only be 5%, which doesn't go to a unitary because it's not within the remit of it. But there is no foundation strategic authority for it to go to because the government hasn't made a decision on that. And what on earth happens is everything currently done by local government across Kent and Medway going to go to the unitaries, in which case then obviously you'll have to take stuff out of the unitaries to put into the FSA. Or are we going to be likely halfway through the reorganisation to unitaries with staff going through TUPE and changes in their contract, and then the FSA is announced, And so either that work stops or, a lot of the staff suddenly get told, you're now being stupid to something else, having been told they're being stupid one way or the other. I just don't see, unless the government can really get this on track with the rest of local government reorganisation here, it's just going to be a complete mess. And it's staff what I'm more worried about than councillors, because there's tens of thousands of people working for, the county council and the boroughs across Kent who won't know, where their roles are going. At the moment I assume you probably don't know the answer to that, but that's the sort of thing I would hope that we would be feeding back, because the whole of the process to me has been predicated, and as you said, Alison, we only supported it, I think, as an authority on the basis of devolution. Reorganisation to unitaries is a completely pointless exercise on its own, unlikely to achieve anything. However, the prize of it was devolution. And the FSA, which is what we're now being offered, is like a halfway house. So I feel, I say, to some extent, we've been sold a pup. We're having to go into reorganisation nobody in this chamber wanted, and devolution maybe there, may not. We're just none the wiser.
I think what you're saying, Paul, is you'd like us to, in our expression of interest, request further clarity on the points you've made. We don't have the clarity yet. In my broad terms, the devolution is money and powers down from central government. So in theory, there won't be centralisation of the functions. However, the reality is there might well be some aspect of centralisation, because clearly Kent do a Kent-wide thing at the moment, and some of that stuff probably would be better sitting in the FSA. So I think there's a lot of unknowns, and we'll make sure we ask for that clarity in the expression of interest.
Thank you. Councillor Coach. Oh, okay. Are there any other comments? Councillor Jones.
Is this a precursor to eventually getting a mayor?
Alison said, "Who knows?" And I think that is the answer. The papers do talk about it being that stepping stone. So in theory, yes, but who knows?
Maybe if I could add, as we've already touched on, there is a difference between foundation strategic authorities and mayoral ones, whether they're whichever category of mayoral authority is concerned. And one of the key things is that the mayoral authorities get their own financial settlement of varying degrees of quantum and freedoms. From what we understand, there are no plans at the moment from the government for another phase of mayoral authorities. Now, that's not to say one couldn't come along. And if we're to believe the policy aspiration and direction of travel in the white paper, we would perhaps expect that to happen. But for the government to be able to do that in the same way that it has in other parts of the country, then the Treasury would need to agree to the allocation of resources. So there are lots of conditions that would have to be satisfied before making that next step up on the ladder. But I'd say that for the reasons that Councillor Harper has outlined, that they're irrespective of whether or not a strategic authority is created, there are things that are better done on a larger geographical scale. It would be simpler if we could do that using one of the provisions in legislation, this legislation, but there are other ways to achieve that. So, for example, you can voluntarily establish joint committees to allow you to do those things together. It's more perhaps a less strong way of doing things, and it doesn't bring the devolution of money for things like schools from central government. So there are ways to do it, and we have seen those mechanisms in place in other parts of the country in the past. For example, between the GLC and the GLA, there were London-wide mechanisms for doing all sorts of things, and that was mostly achieved through joint committees. This is my opinion. I hope we don't need to go down that path, because it's fragile, and I don't think it would be the best way and clearest arrangements for us.
Does this give more credence to option 1, or is it the alternative?
I think this is the alternative. With option 1, I don't think we could have an FSA. It would all be sitting under them, under a single umbrella.
Councillor Harper.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on the point Alison referred to in terms of London. Obviously, I haven't been on a London borough. I'm quite familiar with some of these joint committees, and I, for a long period of time, represented Merton on the London Ecology Committee, and the idea of that was to look at, obviously, ecology across the whole of Greater London. However, not every London borough decided to join it. So some of the authorities, I'm trying to places like Bromley, or a number of them didn't join it. So when you looked at ecology in London, it was ecology in like a jigsaw. Most of the councils, most of the 32 boroughs and the City of London were in it. Well, then there was probably about half a dozen who weren't. They were the larger outer London boroughs. It all became a bit of a problem. Other joint committees in London typically would be around things like perhaps transport, or on cemeteries and crematorium, given the density of London, and those things tended to work quite well. But it's definitely better to have something which has statutory authority, which means that everybody has to be in it. The last thing I think we'd want to find in Kent is, I don't know, 2 or 3 out of 4 councils being in something, and say the middle of Kent opting out. So you've got a donut approach. But I'm happy to move the recommendations we've got on page 11. I think, encouraging the Cabinet to move forward with, expressing interest in the Foundation Strategic Authority, obviously, of the caveats which have come up this evening, seems to be the best way forward for us. I think. Probably the only way forward.
Okay, thank you. That brings us nicely on to the recommendation on page 11. So there are 4 recommendations. I'm just going to take them all at once. So the recommendations 1 to 4 on page 11, are they agreed? Thank you very much. Okay, item 11. So the quarterly risk update. This is going to be introduced by Councillor Summersgill, the Cabinet Member for Corporate Resources.
Thank you, Chair. Just as background, the updates to the Corporate Risk Register reported as a standalone item in order to ensure due consideration is given to risks. A review of the Council's corporate risk was carried out with the Cabinet and a wider leadership team back in May 2025, and that formed the basis of the current Corporate Risk Register and the updates we're reporting here. We update the risks quarterly to ensure effective oversight and monitoring, and they're reviewed and updated by risk owners. So this regular review includes progress on planned actions and changes to risk ratings. Just to mention a few highlights, the team has held workshops about operational risks with individual service areas, and these are listed on page 32, which has been useful in capturing operational risks and raising risk awareness. Corporate risks are shown on page 35, which are broadly unchanged from the second quarter, but is considered the temporary accommodation, financial constraint and cost pressure risks may be downgraded slightly this time. A process of horizon scanning has also been undertaken, which has identified the issues shown on page 36, which are evolving risks listed there, bullet points, and a further risk workshop is planned for 3rd of June this year. So recommended to note the risk update, and myself or Uche would be willing to provide enlightenment if necessary.
Okay, are there any comments or questions? Councillor Harper.
Thanks, Chair. The couple of risks I honed in on this was on page 35 was number 5, inability to deliver the council house building programme, and then number 12 around strategic partnerships. I mean, my quicker question is on strategic partnerships, given Kent County Council and being the biggest partner probably we've got in Kent, and there's the volatility, perhaps, is trying to think of the word, the volatility of relationships with Kent County Council as to whether we think, and I notice obviously the mitigated risk is down at 6, but you know, if there's any evidence of any more stability coming out, something, if I sort of read what Alison said correctly, I imagine that's the authority which may not have expressed any interest around the foundation strategic approach. I might be wrong on that, but yeah, so I do have a concern on KCC. And the other one was inability to deliver house building programme. I notice obviously the mitigated risk hasn't changed, and I see all of our things we've got in listed down there, but I know one of the issues which I think has come up in the past, isn't it, is when proposals were submitted for planning, and they've been sort of slightly deferred or knocked back and a bit, you know, going. And I'm just thinking of the timing now of needing to get stuff through as fast as we can do. We need to go to planning to make, you know, if I can sort of seek assurance from the 2 cabinet members that everything is being done to make sure before we get to planning, it's all tied up. So we shouldn't have any hiccups there as we perhaps have had on a couple of the other ones. And my only other point on the risk register was in light of the war which started on Saturday, you know, when we're talking about the external constraints on the economy and so on, just wondering if we may be about to find the extent of those at the moment.
So I'll come back on, but firstly, the house building, obviously, Councillor Wales isn't here. We've got planning permission for a lot of what we'd be doing, so that's all underway. I'm trying to think, I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head. The key risks are around the cost of building and the ability to ensuring that we get the right level of grant from Homes England. That's all quite live at the moment, so we are having those discussions. We had just 2 hours ago, I was with officers and Simon Wales going through the detail on that. So it's more around the finances and the way that's changed. The strategic partner, well, yeah, I'm not going to say much more on that. It's hard work working with our county council at the moment. I don't think that's any surprise. And in terms of the sort of geopolitical risks, there was a report from there was a national report on major risks. I can't remember who is it. National security, yeah, national security risks, which I shared with Uche a couple of weeks ago. And yeah, I mean, if you fancy nightmares, have a read. I mean, it is really quite scary. It covers everything from war through to climate change and the impacts on the economy of all of that and impacts on people. It's scary times. I used to talk about the poly crisis, and it's kind of there.
Okay, thank you. Any other? Councillor Conrad.
Thank you, Chair. Just a very quick one. Page 46, the second control. Has that been assigned to the correct risk? It seems somewhat out of place.
Existing control or the planned control? Which one did you mean?
That is the cybersecurity assessment and leaders against the risk of local government reorganisation.
Apologies, thank you. It is a planned action, something that the IT team is looking into doing, and it's one of the recommendations as we also prepare for LGR. So it's something that they have commenced already, but not completed.
Thank you. Any other comments? No. Okay, so the recommendation on page 27 is that the risk update be noted. Is that agreed? Thank you. So item 12, this is the quarter finance update. This is again going to be introduced by Councillor Summerskill, the Cabinet Member for Corporate Resources.
Thank you. This report sets out the financial and performance position for reporting for this particular pack as at 31st of December 2025, in other words, end of quarter three. For the council and revenue for the council as a whole, favourable variance now is £654,000 projected surplus for the current financial year, which is an improvement on the 197,000 we projected at the end of quarter two. The two biggest contributors towards this improvement is an increase in the investment income, which is one we've mentioned of the last 2 quarters, and planning policy, with a variance arising from less work being required in-house than originally assumed. The biggest overspend offsetting these favourable variances relates to Lockmeadow, where expenditure has been incurred on dilapidations at the health club, which is hoped that some or all of these can be recouped from the former tenant. On the capital side, some capital expenditure is projected to slip into the next financial year. 1.4 million for corporate property acquisitions has not been spent, owing to no suitable opportunities arising in this past quarter. And there's also been some slippage on the purchase of temporary accommodation, with some of these transactions likely now to fall into the next financial year. Quality Homes for Life remains within budget for the lifetime of the programme, but is overspent this year, mainly because of an earlier than expected payment of £500,000 to the National House Building Warranty Scheme for the Springfield, the post office. Yep. The report also deals with debt collection and treasury management. Debt collection for council tax is slightly behind target, but for business rates is ahead of target. And the treasury management position remains comfortable, with cash balances of 45 million at the end of December. There are a number of irrecoverable business rate debts which are recommended for write-off, as we seem to come up with every quarter. So I'll leave that report there to ask questions of myself or Mark.
Thank you. Are there any? Okay, Councillor Harper.
Thank you, Chair. I thought this was, it was fairly good news, because if we've got some underspend, then hopefully we can think of some extra things to do early in the new financial year with the money. I've got a couple of things on the revenue. I was looking on page 66 and 67, and I note what the Cabinet member said about Lockmeadow. But my questions on those 2 pages were on the leisure centre. Is the issue around utility cost increase in excess of the contractually agreed amount? So I just wondered if this is, given utility costs only tend to go in one direction, whether this is likely to be, an ongoing thing over time, that unless we can adjust our contracts with, is it Serco, isn't it? Yeah. Unless we can do something with Serco, presumably this could reoccur. And the other one, which And I know obviously the temporary homelessness figures on the whole are good in terms of revenue. And I said at the council meeting last week, I hope that we can, you know, it stays like that. But I suppose I was a bit concerned to see that in terms of the properties we've purchased over the last 4 or 5 years, that we seem to have run into a third of £1 million liability or overspend in terms of, that's my understanding, that we're not actually keeping these properties we now own up to spec. Because there aren't that many of them. There's about, well, it depends what numbers, what you're doing, but if you're doing it on the P&R one, there's about 50 to 80 of those properties, I think. And it just struck me as 363,000 quid of outstanding maintenance is a big figure. And we want to be an exemplar landlord. So I would hope that we can, get that work done, but make sure that going forward, all of our properties are kept in good condition, because I'm sure, like with every councillor, I get private tenants coming to me with issues. The idea of ending up with our own tenants coming to us on issues would not be good. And treasury management, my question links into my last point on the risk register. I just wondered if our 35 million pound we've got in the private sector, when you look at that list on page 73, whether there's much in the way of assets invested potentially in companies which may be associated with war, or even the United States, because we might think whether those are sensible investments given the volatility America's introduced into, the global economy as of Saturday morning.
Okay, deal with them in order, but probably Mark will be answering the detail. The leisure centre overspend on utility costs. Is that just the general price rise in electricity?
Yes, what happens with the contract with Serco is that they bear utility cost increases up to a certain percentage. So if there are increases higher than that, we bear the costs, and that's what's happened in this instance. But we hope that, well, who knows what's going to happen now with war in the Middle East, but you'd hope that that would just be a one-off.
Yeah, and prices may go down in April, of course, for next year. Who knows? The second one, the temporary accommodation, we have for next financial year, we have a specific 250,000 specified for bringing our estate up to standard that we particularly wish it to be better than usual, I suppose. But Mark, you were mentioning the number of properties that this applies to, I think.
It is just under 200 properties we own now. The other thing to say about those properties is because they're used for temporary accommodation and there's quite a high turnover of tenants, the cost of maintaining them is perhaps higher than it would be if there were long-term tenants. But we recognise, as Councillor Summerskill has said, that there will be an ongoing cost, which we are now in next year's budget allowing for.
And the last one on investments. Yes, I think we'd be careful with our investments, but investing in America is, even most of my pension is invested sadly in American companies.
Do we have ethical policies? Because I think we do have that type of policy, so I'm sure I've heard it come up before.
Yeah, maybe if I could just elaborate. The investments that you'll see here are mostly short-term investments. The ones with local authorities are self-explanatory, but you'll see that a lot of money is held with money market funds. We don't interrogate the money market funds as to how they in turn are investing their funds. They will be investing over a whole range of securities, but mostly debt rather than equity. We don't have a specific policy on ethical investment because, unlike a pension fund, we don't have long-term equity investments. So it's not something that we've ever considered here. We have looked into whether there are such things as ethical money market funds, but they're very few and far between. So unfortunately, we wouldn't be getting the range of potential investment opportunities that we have just going out to the general money market universe.
Thank you. I've got a quick question. It's on page 66. Obviously, don't want to prejudice any legal proceedings, but can you clarify what the sort of time frame is on? Because I'm presuming that the claim for dilapidation is against a national company. I'm not going to say who it is, but I'm guessing it's a national company. What are we looking at in terms of time frame for making that claim?
We have submitted a claim. We weren't able to submit the claim until the work had taken place at the health club at Lock Meadow. This is a fairly usual situation, though, when a tenancy comes to an end, that dilapidation claims are brought against former tenants. So I anticipate there will be a negotiation with the former tenant, and now that we've submitted the claim, I'd hope that that could be brought to a conclusion quite quickly.
Thank you. Okay, so the recommendations on page 49. I'll take them all in one go as well. So there's 3 recommendations on page 49 because they're for noting. Oh yeah, and the write-off of the uncollectible. So those 3 recommendations, are they agreed? Thank you. So item number 13. I'm looking for some. Right. HB housing payments policy. This is going to be introduced again by Councillor Summerskill, the Cabinet Member for Corporate Resources.
Yes, thank you. This is quite a just a topic that something has changed, so we have to change the policy. From 1st of April, the government's changing the discretionary support that's provided towards housing costs as additional support, where housing benefit or universal credit is in payment. And this report provides detail of the changes in the background to what we now have to put in as a housing payments policy. So we've administered a discretionary housing payment scheme since 2001, allowing the council to top up any shortfall between housing benefit and rent on a discretionary basis. The government plans to bring this scheme together with a household support fund with effect from 1st of April and calling it a Crisis and Resilience Fund, CRF. The discretionary housing payments is paid and administered by district councils, but housing support fund is distributed to county councils with districts given separate amounts to distribute. The government has agreed that districts can continue to receive a housing payments fund grant of 231,984, equivalent to the former DHP housing payments that we received. But a housing payments policy is required for this new fund. It's based on the former housing payments discretionary policy, and it will allow the new scheme to be administered along the same lines. Revenues and benefit officers will continue to work closely with the welfare officer in the Safer Stronger Communities team who administers the housing support fund, household support fund. That's obviously Zoe can answer far more details on the fund for it.
Thank you very much. Actually, I have a couple of questions to start. Page 90, there's a list of primary objectives of the scheme. The last one on there is encourage employment. So having read the policy, I'm a bit unclear as to how this policy encourages employment, so I'd like some clarification on that, please. And secondly, on page 91, the rent in advance deposits, so section 5, there's an assumption there that people will not have any money when they are moving house, and actually there are quite a number of tenants who will have got a deposit back from their previous house, or will have been paying rent in advance and will have a month's rent already up front. So how is that sort of taken into account as well? So those are my two questions.
Thank you, Chair. So I've started thinking about the rent in advance, and I've completely forgotten the first question. The first question was
The employment.
oh, the employment.
Yeah.
Yep. So it may be that somebody's always had their rent paid in full, and then they start employment. They've got to get used to the salary they'll be getting, or they may be on a 0-hour contract. So we may give them a short top up for a little while to get them going while they start work. Somebody might have to move to take on a job. We might give them help then. This is only people that get housing benefits or housing costs. So it's quite a small group of people, but we wouldn't want to stop somebody taking employment because they couldn't manage to pay the whole of their rent. So that's the purpose of it being in the policy.
Okay, thank you. That's not actually clear in the policy, so
Okay.
so that'd be useful if that was clarified.
Yep.
Thank you. And the second question?
The second question, so deposits and rent in advance, I think having worked with landlords on the people that have come in, for example, on the Syrian scheme, that quite often deposits aren't paid back, that there's a way of finding damage and saying, you know, you're not getting this part of your deposit back. So tenants don't always get the whole of their deposits back. But there's always some people that may have been living with parents, had a baby or something like that, and we need to help them with a deposit. The rent in advance, it could be that somebody hasn't had, there's been a reason why they at that point haven't had their rent in advance. I completely understand what you're saying, but we're dealing with the people that really struggle with life here, and the main purpose of the policy is to stop people going into temporary accommodation or to bring them out of a hostel, somewhere like that, so that they are able to fulfill their life living in a proper tenancy.
Thank you. Will they have to then show that they haven't had a deposit back, or they don't have a month's rent in advance?
So we do a lot of work with the housing team. So we take applications from the housing team. The housing team aren't allowed to assess discretionary housing payments. It has to be done by a housing benefit officer, but we'll take recommendations from the housing team. So it may be somebody they've been working with at Trinity, something like that, you know, somebody that they've been working with for a long time. And if they say this person needs rent in advance for a deposit, we know they've been through it and worked out whether they've had a deposit back or whatever, you know, in whatever circumstances.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Parfitt.
Chairman, yes, I can certainly concur. I've been on the sharp end of a landlord that doesn't want to pay a deposit back, and it can be a battle, that's for sure. I suppose my question is, what is the purpose of this change? I mean, obviously, I'm not expecting you to read the minds of the government, but it just seems, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to me as to why they've done this. And the only reason, and me being rather cynical, is that they've done this because they think it's going to save them money somehow. And I'm just concerned about what, if there is, you're anticipating an additional burden on the council, because it's very unlikely they'd go to all of this trouble for no reason whatsoever.
So this came in, and I was actually at a conference when it was introduced by the DWP, and so I was one of the first up with my hand because I like to challenge them at any point. And to say we are not going through reorganisation in the next year, if you give the county council our discretionary housing payment pot, we may not get it back. So I think they're policy makers. It's a policy decision that in the future, when they've got unitary authorities across the land, that if somebody needs help, it's one pot of money. So they're putting together the household support fund with the discretionary housing payment fund. So somebody can come along and they need help. And as I've put in the report or the policy as an example, you know, we might help somebody in the future with their electricity bills, and then they can afford the shortfall in their rent. So it's about getting people so that they can manage their lives in full. And it's the pot. I think for a number of years they will keep the housing part separate, because there's no point in giving everybody a fridge and people aren't able to pay their rent. But unfortunately, they've brought it in a little bit early. So for the next 2 years, district authorities get the discretionary housing payment part of it. I presume if reorganisation is delayed by a year, that they'll say, oh, we're still paying this to the district authorities.
So it is going to come via Kent County Council. So we're adding in another layer. No.
No, and all the time we're a district authority, that the housing payments funding comes directly to us.
It makes sense now. Thank you.
Councillor Couch.
Thank you, Chair. The document reads that there's a lot of flexibility and nuance for the officers to determine cases, which makes a lot of sense considering what you're talking about. But is there any more detail that can be provided on whether any factors are weighted higher against others? As in, does the pot run out at any point? And is there any kind of like recourse for someone to, if they were to complain and say, well, why didn't I get it, that there's slightly more detail in the policy as to why one factor is weighted higher than another? Or is that not an issue that arises, if that makes sense?
We have to be very careful with our budget. We divide it by 12. And for example, probably I should have looked at how much we've spent as of this week before I came over, but we've probably almost spent the budget. But what we do is we'd hold an application that came in now and we'd pay it in April. That there's never ever any saying no. We weight it on the best reason for keeping some, sorry, this isn't very well worded, but who would want to keep in a property. So if you've got a family, you want them to stay in a property. And if you've got, as an example, we had an application in with a boy who was in year 11 in a secondary school. We don't want them to get evicted from a property. You're affecting a family's life going forward then. So it's looking at that sort of thing. The applications we turn down are normally for rent arrears, where we've cleared rent arrears and then the person comes back again and we've told them they've got to start topping up their rent. And, you know, we have to be a bit tough sometimes and say to people, you need, because we can help with, them help with managing their money. There's you know, the welfare officer is really good at signposting people, so that's the normal reason.
Thank you, Councillor Johns. Councillor Harper.
Thank you, Chair. I think the policy we've got here is, you know, is good and hopefully will achieve the thing. I'm just going to pick up a couple of points. I mean, one of the issues we need to remember is with universal credit, it operates considerably in arrears. So people on universal credit, almost the bulk of cases, and I work for a welfare rights organisation dealing with benefits. Most people on universal credit will end up falling into debt because the way it works is, I say, it's paid in arrears, and if your point, Chair, if you go into work, they then reduce your stuff. But the way it goes through, it's reduced quicker than your extra money coming through. So there's always gaps. And equally, if you're on a 0 hours contract, it's even more of a nightmare for a tenant or a resident because a month when you work extra, they'll assume that's a permanent adjustment to you and they reduce your universal credit. Next month, you only work half those hours, and it's about 3 months before your universal credit comes back up to actually get you on a stable platform with it. And the other thing I was just going to point out on 2.5 is one of the reasons we see lots of London boroughs putting their homeless people outside of Greater London is this issue around the local housing allowances. Generally, they're set well below the level of rent. So if you live in London, if you're a tenant in London and you're on benefits, your local housing allowance, which authority can help you with, is probably set at about half of what your rent will be. And so people automatically fall into arrears, get made homeless. The London boroughs can't afford to, because of that local housing allowance, to actually find anywhere for them to live there. So it's cheaper to send them to Maidstone or Kent. Or there was an article on the radio last week, County Durham is a favoured area. So, you know, you may have lived all your life and all your family could be, I don't know, in Croydon, and then you're shipped off to County Durham. And that's the impacts of the local housing allowance. So these are sort of issues which our officers are, you know, having to deal with the limited money we've got. So I can only really take my hat off to them as to how they managed to juggle it to keep it within 231,984 quid.
I just noticed that the government's not changing the figure in line with any uplift in inflation for the next 2 years either, so it's sticking it where it was.
Just to come back on that, if a London borough houses people in Maidstone, they're the responsibility of the London borough, so we wouldn't be spending our discretionary housing payment budget on them unless they find a property of their own back here and they become a proper resident of Maidstone. All the time they're housed on a temporary basis, that it's their housing benefit claim goes through the London borough. It's just council tax that comes through us. I don't think so. I'll come back to you on that.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Jenkins-Baldock.
I just wanted to ask if there was data available on uptake by ward.
We could have a look at that. We could possibly come back perhaps a while into the next scheme and then give a feedback so that you can look at that.
Thank you. Councillor Coach.
I don't know if I'm asking for a metric that doesn't exist, but is there such thing as the calculation of pounds spent in this way to then savings of what would have been spent on temporary accommodation? And because that's the argument here, right, is that you're keeping them out and saving us the cost in the future. And can this fund be topped up by the council itself, or can it only be spent from the government funding that we receive?
We don't hold that information at our fingertips, but it is something that we could look into. And yes, we can top it up. Over the last couple of years, we've been quite lucky with the money that's gone into the housing team for temporary accommodation and for helping people towards rent arrears. That's such a thing. But I spoke to John Littlemore a couple of weeks ago and he said that is stopping. So it'd be interesting to see how it's spent over the next year.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments? Okay, so the recommendation is on page 79. And it's to adopt the housing payments policy. So is that agreed? Okay, thank you. So item 14, biodiversity duty report. So this is going to be introduced by Councillor Rodwell, Cabinet Member for Climate Transition and Nature Recovery.
Well, welcome to the Biodiversity Duty Report 2021 to 2026. And I just want to start off with a huge thanks to Shelley. You have worked inordinately hard to compile this, and hopefully you can get your life back now after the amount of work you have put in gathering all this information. So first of all, the technical stuff. The biodiversity duty reporting originates from the Environment Act 2021, which strengthened the existing duty under Section 40A of the Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act 2006. The Act expanded the duty from simply conserving biodiversity to conserving and enhancing it, and introduced a legal requirement for most public authorities to publish regular biodiversity reports. The Act requires local authorities to publish a biodiversity duty report by the 26th of March 2026, so we're approaching. The report must summarise actions taken to meet the biodiversity duty, outline plans for the next 5 years, and include information on biodiversity net gain where relevant. This is the Council's first such report and is being presented for approval and publication in accordance with the statutory deadline. The purpose of introducing mandatory reporting was to increase transparency and accountability in how public bodies contribute to nature recovery and create a national evidence-based informing the Environmental Improvement Plan and long-term biodiversity targets. A biodiversity duty report must show how a public authority has considered what action it can take to conserve and enhance biodiversity, set policies and objectives based on that consideration, and has taken and plans to take action to deliver these objectives. For local planning authorities, the reports must also evidence how biodiversity net gain duties are being implemented and quantified BNG outcomes from development approvals. The overall purpose of this is to demonstrate compliance with the strengthened statutory duties, support joined-up monitoring of biodiversity recovery, and embed nature considerations across all public decision-making. I'm going to repeat that, embed nature considerations across all public decision-making. Now, by law, all biodiversity duty reports must include a summary of actions already taken to comply with the biodiversity duty, planned actions for the next reporting period, and any additional contextual information the authority considers appropriate. These reports show compliance with the legal duty to further the conservation of biodiversity in their functions, covering everything from land management to procurement and planning decisions, and contribute towards national targets. Now, compliance with the biodiversity duty is an integral part of decision making, and it is essential to achieving the goals outlined in the DEFRA's recently published Environmental Improvement Plan and the local priorities set out emerging local nature recovery strategies. And the contents of the report have been sourced from activities originating from the Biodiversity Strategy 2025 to 2030, the Biodiversity Action Plan 2025 to 2030, the Biodiversity and Climate Change Strategy 2020 to 2025, and the Biodiversity and Climate Change Action Plan 2020 to 2025. Phew, that's the technical stuff. The rights of nature is at the very heart of our council mission to deliver an ambitious body of work. Now, our Nature Recovery Declaration sets the overarching commitment to tackle habitat loss, supporting climate adaptation and embedding biodiversity considerations across services. This commitment is delivered through the Biodiversity Strategy 2025 to 2030, which provides the long-term framework for protecting, restoring, and connecting habitats, reducing pesticide use, improving land management practices, and integrating nature based solutions throughout council operations and across the borough. The accompanying Biodiversity Action Plan 2025 to 2030 sets out detailed actions such as identifying priority habitats, expanding protected sites, increasing tree and hedgerow cover, developing a propagation programme, which really excites me, for endangered local species. And the list goes on and on and on. And it's all here, it's all in this report. And it's an incredibly expensive body of work. And it does my heart good to see how much we have already achieved as a council in terms of habitat restoration and nature recovery. And the way we are working towards building climate resilience, it's a thoroughly systemic approach, tackling far-reaching impacts of climate change and biodiversity collapse. And Kent, you know, we have to say, is seeing the steepest decline of insect populations across the UK. It is scary. And the other thing that's important to say is that, you know, it reflects the resolve of this council to do as much as we can to protect biodiversity for the generations to come. This report reflects the hard work that's been undertaken from councillors across the political spectrum and the officers who work tirelessly, and the parks team who I saw a few weeks ago, and I was astounded at their dedication, their expertise, their commitment to doing as much as they can to restore nature within within Maidstone. And finally, a special thanks to my predecessor, Councillor Summerskill. I have floated into this role quite late, and I do acknowledge the amount of work you've already done. So here is this report, really to approve so that we can get it published. And I just wanted to end with, you know, the amount of work that has been undertaken and is being undertaken. It's so exciting that we have, as a council, just achieved the Gold Award from the Kent Wildlife Trust's Wilder Kent, and it just reflects the collegiate approach of all of us working together to ensure that our nature is sustained for the generations to come. That is that. So I welcome any questions. If it's technical, please ask Shelley, because she knows her stuff.
Thank you very much. And yes, that's fantastic. I've got 3 speakers that have requested to speak. Councillor Harper.
Thank you, Chair. I agree with the Cabinet member. The Council has been working on these issues from 2020. So we've got 5 years of track record on the issue, which is, to some extent, I didn't see, having read this in detail, well, thoroughly earlier today. I didn't see it reflected in this. We've got a good report in terms of telling us what our strategy is, but what it doesn't do is it doesn't particularly evidence the outcomes we've achieved. So I think I would suggest that tonight, after tonight's meeting, that we agree that the Cabinet member with the officer look at this again in terms of putting in case studies and more evidence-based, because we've got 26 pages here, largely telling us what our strategy is, but is fairly weak in terms of what the outcomes have been, as I say, for the last 5 years. And if I just go through and highlight some of the areas where I've spotted this sort of thing. So if we go to page 118 or page 6 of the report, for instance, we fall into, well, for lay people read this, into jargon. So we talk about the establishment of fast forests. Well, a forest by its nature can't be fast. Trees take anything up to 30 to 100 years to grow. So whilst I'd like them to be there immediately, it's not going to be that quick. And what is a fast forest the public can understand compared to a small an area of woodland or a copse? So I've run through the points just to give you an idea where I think with a bit more revision that we can really make a good report. Then on the next page, actually, I think we just need to make sure that the principal ecologist, which apparently is we're in the process of recruiting, will get in post pretty quick, since we're about to be abolished in a year and a half's time. So he or her won't have that much time to get in. And will we have that as a permanent or a fixed term post, given where the council is? Then we refer to, on that same page, biodiversity, BG, and there's a lot of abbreviations. So biodiversity gain plan has to be maintained for 30 years. Well, I just wondered, is that enforceable? Because most of the planning applications coming up are like a conversion of a garage, building of a couple of rooms on a house. The likelihood of the person living there for 30 years is probably pretty close to zero. So I wondered, we put that there, and I understand it's a policy, but is it deliverable? And then the next paragraph, 3.2, bearing in mind we've had 20% biodiversity, and previous to that, requirements for biodiversity net gains. The only thing is so in the last X years, there's only four examples quoted there, which struck me as surely there's been a lot more planning applications coming through and approved with biodiversity net gains. I mean, hundreds come through to planning committee, let alone the fact that for say 100 committee reports, there's probably 300 or 400 planning applications. So there must be a flood of stuff coming through with biodiversity net gain requirements, even on a greater or lesser scale, which doesn't seem to be particularly clear there, for instance. And then on page 122, it probably sounds negative, but I'm trying to be positive. I'm trying to say where I think we can improve it by a bit more work. We referred to, in paragraph 4.2, the council manages a range of green spaces. Well, I think it'd be worth putting a quantity in it, because that could be we own 1 acre of land in the borough, or we own 1,000 acres of land, and I expect it's probably nearer 1,000 acres, bearing in mind Moat Park's 450 acres just on one space. So that would give people a better idea of the volume of stuff we're doing. And then again on page 12 of the report on 122, sort of 2/3 of the way down in section 6.2, we're saying that our second objective is to bolster native species, planting mix and so on. And I just felt it'd be useful to put an idea of scale, because whilst obviously we're doing it, and if we've only just started it, fair enough, we might have done 1 or 2 case studies. I think in a lot of lists, it struck me as case studies could be really useful. Again, moving on to the next page on the 7.2, we refer to increase our plans for trying to increase tree cover by between sort of 5% a year and hedgerows 10%, as you said, Rachel. I think it'd be good to have a few case examples of where we've actually done it, because I mean I've been doing tree planting in my ward for donkey's years. I know it's fed back in, but I really think case studies bring it to life. And then again on 7.2, we were talking about the conservation plans for most of our parks and so on. Just wanted, again, be worth doing a case study, just of one of them, just to tell us, to fill in what it is. Because I think we've got a good story here. And I know we've got a good story of the work we've been doing, I say over the last 5 or 6 years. I just didn't feel it came out. This was good on the policy, but I just felt it lacked a bit on evidence. Now, I know there is, towards the end, you've got the key actions log, but even still in the text, things like this can really be enlivened by things like case studies and sort of infographics and so on, because we're sending this off to some civil servant and they're not going to look at all the sort of links in it to other stuff. They'll just look at this. So we want to wow them, don't we? We want them to think, good, Maidstone's done a real lot of good stuff, because this report with that sort of data, we could share with the press, we could use it to show what we're doing. I just felt, having read it, it sounded okay, but it just didn't raise enough for the good work we have been doing. I say there's good examples in the borough, and case studies I think really could add a lot of value to it. So I just urge that to be looked at.
Can I just say that, yeah, I mean, detailed case studies evidencing it, and I take all that on board. Something I just wanted to quickly say about the fast forests. I know it does sound like a jargon, doesn't it? But what it involves, and there's one being set up at Midley Park, just where near where I live, and the sort of variety of whips are planted very, very close together, much more closely than you'd ever anticipate when you're planting a conventional woodland. And the idea is that they compete for light, and because they're competing for light, they grow incredibly quickly. Is that the way? Yeah. Milwaukee method, but that's a case in point is that it's when things are in here that people are understanding what it is, and I take on board case studies. Did you want to add anything to that, Shelley?
Thank you, Councillor Rodwell and Councillor Harper. Feedback very gratefully received. That was really the point of this exercise, to pick up on details that we might have missed. So I have made a record of all of the points that you have suggested, and I think they are quite easy fixes to incorporate. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Couch.
Thank you, Chair. I was slightly the opposite to Councillor Harper, and there were loads of examples of projects in there that I hadn't heard about and thought they were really interesting. And I've got loads of questions, but I'll maybe follow up in a separate email to the officer about those. But just on the kind of concept of the report as a statutory requirement, that is the first one that we've had to do. It was just wondering whether there had been any benefits to all this work and pulling the information together, and whether there's anything we've learned or figured out about how we're approaching biodiversity from a strategic perspective as a result of doing the work. And similarly, whether we'll be able to access other or any councils or other Kent councils reports of the same nature, and whether we can benchmark ourselves against them. It sounds like obviously we're doing quite well. If there's any learnings we can take from other people's reports. And then, yeah, similar to Councillor Harper, whether it be possible, I know this was a first version of a very big document, but going forward, whether we have the data on co-benefits of biodiversity. We know that we've done loads of work, and we know that we've done work to improve biodiversity itself, but kind of from the perspective of our residents, what the co-benefits are around health and social improvements as a result of some of these projects. Thank you.
Thank you. Yep. Councillor Parfitt.
Thank you, Chairman. It's interesting because the comment that I actually wrote is very similar to that I'd written earlier today, was that this is excellent at documenting activity. There's a huge amount of activity in there, but what I felt was missing is how are we going to measure what we've achieved? How is that going to be shown and evidenced? So I do think there's an awful lot going on here, but what I want to know is what we are doing making a difference? And the fast forest, again, fast forest, I had to Google that because I thought, what on earth's a fast forest? And I did, and it wasn't just as you described there. The definition I've got, that it could be all sorts of things. It could be about growing food as well, and that instantly piqued my attention, and then my mind went on to that. To me, would be a very good learning opportunity for schools and things like that. Whether we can look at something like that, I don't know, because I think that is really important, is teaching children where our food comes from and how we can grow food locally. And then the final question I just had is obviously the ecology principle. Is that a statutory duty, or is that just something that we've decided to do based on how it would help us move forward, or is that something that we have to do? Thank you.
From my understanding, it's something that we are hoping that will really enhance and help us focus on what we really need to be focusing on in terms of the few years we have left, to make sure that we maximise the best possible outcomes. I'm just going to pass that to Shelley, though. Do you agree it's not statutory, it's something that we want to implement.
Thank you, Councillor
Completely
Rodwell.
wrong.
No. To be honest, I'm not 100% sure myself because this does sit within a different team, but my understanding is that there is not a statutory requirement, but we do need to access a principal ecologist throughout the process from time to time. And at this point in time, we have contracted ours as a shared service through KCC. And so this would allow us to bring that in-house and how we use that or access that service according to what the in-house team's needs are. So that's my understanding, is that there would be benefits by bringing it in-house.
Thank you. Can I just come back on one thing? I should have been much more explicit. The Fast Forest, we have planted fruit trees, rhubarb, blackberries, different herbs. We've got lavender growing around to introduce more pollinators. So the idea is it's a community space. It's a little picket fence around it at Midley, where the community can go in and forage. And we're going to be actively involving the local schools. They already know, and they're already getting ready to do planting. And for me, these little community forests are a place where we can really engage everybody to invest in this. And what's better than having something like a little mini orchard in the middle of an urban environment? So yes, in Midley we have the different range of trees that are, I can't think of the word, native trees, like the hawthorns and the blackthorns and the spindle. We've got a little patch there, and then we've got this separate little patch of a fruit forest or a tiny forest with all the food growing. So yeah, it's excited, and it's been extended across the borough.
Thank you. Councillor Jeffrey.
Yeah, we're having 5 food forests. I visited the Midley one last couple of days ago. It's going to be amazing. Just wanted to come back on the monitoring stuff. Section 7.4 details a few of the monitoring bits. I mean, I'd love us to go further than what's in there, but there is some monitoring there. Obviously, it is quite a difficult thing to monitor generally in terms of biodiversity, but yeah, so there is some, but I'd love to do more.
Thank you. And I've got Councillor Cannon.
Thank you, Chairman. On page 130, it highlights that Maidstone is experiencing rapid growth in viticulture, and then discusses this in relation to biodiversity. The report also on this page says the council may need to consider applying an Article 4 direction to prevent the use of permitted development rights that could enable vineyard establishment. Could I have assurance from the leader and the cabinet member that you wouldn't use that Article 4 direction and you'd support our wine industry to grow in Maidstone and the borough?
So we've just said in the report that we won't have to consider it. So no, I'm not going to say that we're not going to do it, because we're saying we might have to do it. I mean, viticulture is it's changing the landscape of our farming. You well know, as a farmer yourself, far better than I do. It's also quite heavily intensive in terms of pesticides and so forth. So there are some significant problems there. So yeah, we're going to be looking at it.
Thank you. Okay, so the recommendation is on page 107. So I'll try and take them all at once. Is that agreed? Okay, all right. Yeah, fair enough. So subject to discussion. You need to actually, yeah.
Sorry, Councillor Harper, I just wanted clarity on those subject to.
Just all I said was, if we just add in subject to the points raised in the debate tonight, it's just so that Yeah, I mean, that's obviously Stuart and Rachel have been nodding away and Shelley, but it's worth formally having it in the recommendation that they put those in.
Okay, that's fine. Would you mind me clarifying it just a little bit and saying something along the lines of subject to conversations regarding case studies of biodiversity net gain being included? Would that be acceptable?
Yeah, I mean, I just want what we've all said this evening to be picked up in it with the case studies and everything. So yeah.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Item number 15, river and nature restoration. So this is again going to be introduced by Councillor Rodwell, the Cabinet Member for Climate Transition and Nature Recovery.
Thank you. So this report, we're asking the committee to consider to approve a grant of 87,600 to Kent Wildlife Trust to deliver the river restoration project described in the report, to approve a grant of up to 30,000 to match Environment Agency funding for flood mitigation measures in Headcorn, and to delegate authority to the Director of Finance and Resources in consultation with the Cabinet Member for Climate Transition and Nature Recovery to conclude legal agreements with the Kent Wildlife Trust and Environment Agency. So restoring rivers and reversing environmental degradation can play a crucial role in managing biodiversity, as well as enabling adaptation to climate change by managing flood risk. This report describes a proposed 2-year project of river restoration, focusing on the lower belt and the Green Sand Ridge. Additionally, the report seeks confirmation of funding for a project to deliver household flood protection in Headcorn. In 2023, the Overview and Scrutiny Committee undertook a review of the water management cycle and proposed that suitable schemes be undertaken that would have a beneficial impact on the water management cycle. For example, places and infrastructure being resilient to future flood risks, supports the Council's carbon and sustainability ambitions, enhances the environment by creating and improving and restoring habitats and rivers, and meets statutory requirements, for example, complying with the Reservoir Act duties. Overview and Scrutiny recommended to the Cabinet that it was agreed that 100,000 was put aside from the Flood Action Plan within the capital programme for suitable schemes. Following earlier scoping, feasibility and design work by South East River Trust on a number of proposed flood management schemes in the River Shareway catchment had limited success in engaging willing partners. The recommended focus is now on 2 schemes which have been identified as feasible and deliverable. South East River Trust has already identified that successful engagement of farmers and landowners is a fundamental challenge due to the conflict of balancing a range of environmental and economic factors in a very challenging economic climate for agriculture, and where opportunities for accessing funding for projects is limited. It is crucial that projects need to give the leading role to farmers themselves, and to maximise benefits to the environment, there needs to be a number of farmers involved. And this is where farming clusters come in, the model of which has had particular success across Kent in delivering environmental improvements. For example, the Ashford farming cluster on the Upper Belt, facilitated by the Kent Wildlife Trust and Partnership working to deliver restoration projects and natural flood solutions. I recently spent a day up there with the Lower Belt farmers to see how natural flood management happens in practice. And we got very, very wet indeed as we were wading through the wetlands and the scrapes to see just how water can be held back, and also the habitats that are thriving around this wetland. So this proposal by Kent Wildlife Trust also seeks to support farming clusters, but this time on the Lower Belt, and it offers a credible means of delivering the Council's objectives of locally led restoration schemes, which offers longevity, being a 2-year project with the appointment of this Kent Wildlife Trust project officer to help coordinate and to build connections with the different clusters, to advise if needed, and to support and seeking new pathways for funding they have plenty of experience in doing so. It also gives credibility, and with Kent Wildlife Trust, excellent track record in delivering these types of projects. And increased funding opportunities, which Kent Wildlife Trust is well placed to secure. And of course, their familiarity already with our district and our stakeholders, with more opportunities to foster positive relationships. And additionally to this, as reported to the Climate Transition Corporate and Environmental Services pack in September 2025, the Environment Agency has identified Headcorn as an area with critical mass of homes that are at risk of flooding. The Environment Agency has now signed a contract with consultants, JBA, to deliver phase 1 of the project, initial property flood resilience surveys. This work commenced in January 2026. A total of 34 properties are registered for initial surveys, subject to funding being secured. So KCC, as the lead local flood authority, has agreed to provide partnership funding that covers installations for 14 properties in Oldcombe. It will also contribute work for 20 high-risk properties in Headcorn affected by fluvial flooding. That is when the volume of water is not contained, the capacity of the river, and then the water is expels into lower lying areas and causes the floodplains. And of course, there's the surface water runoff issue too, which is causing major problems. So Cabinet indicated its support in principle last September, at which point the Environment Agency had requested 63,000 contribution in order to meet the budget gap on the project. However, the project now faces a reduced shortfall of 30,000 out of total of approximately 1 million. So Cabinet is asked to confirm its commitment to meet this shortfall to enable the Environment Agency to proceed as planned, deliver meaningful flood protection for the communities in Headcorn and Oldcombe. I think we can all agree that the benefits of working positively with partners and our farming communities and restoring our important river catchment habitats and having a more joined up approach for finding different solutions to safeguard our communities from the increased risk of flooding as we face more prolonged wet winters. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I just ask, is there any consideration of clearing some of the silt from the river? Because obviously the more silt there is, the less water you can have in and some over spills.
I'm not aware of that. I was going to be asking Shelley if she knew, but she's not here at the moment. But I can actually refer that question to Shelley and get that back to you. Do you actually? Yeah, okay.
I mean, certainly, my understanding is the approach has changed quite significantly over the last 10 to 20 years, and in general, dredging rivers speeds them up rather than slows them down. And the idea is you want to slow them down. So you encourage natural flooding and barriers rather than allowing the water to drain straight through. You'll have seen, well, I don't know if you saw back in winter of 2013 when they had to close Maidstone Bridge completely because they were worried it was going to collapse under the weight of water that was coming under there. It got within about a foot of the top of the arch, and that's the effect. One of the effects of desilting. So desilting isn't done. People are moving away from it, and I know that's got a long way to go in terms of some of the understanding on that, but it's generally not done these days.
Thank you, Councillor Harper.
Yeah, I read this report with interest, and I suppose I was a bit surprised that they've only identified 34 properties in Headcorn and Oldcombe, given some of the flooding issues that have been in the past. But if that's what they've identified, that's fine. And I support giving it the £30,000 to make sure the £1 million available. But it's obviously fairly heavy engineering. Because if you're spending £1 million on 34 properties, it's an average of around £30,000 per house. So, yeah, but I'm sure the experts know what needs to be done to preserve these properties. My other question was actually when I was reading through the Kent Wildlife Trust proposals, sort of pages 148 to 151, I've tried to understand how, especially the figures on page 151, where they're saying that the cost, and it struck me as it seems because it's headed up MBC funding request. So year one it's £98,000, and year two it was £110,000 for a total of £208,000. How that compared to the £87,600, which we're now being asked to grant, because unless Kent Wildlife Trust have identified £120,000 from elsewhere, we're only putting in the money to do just under half the project and not even enough for the whole of year one. So I'm just trying to understand in my mind. It's a good project, but where has it been funded?
Thank you, Councillor Harper. Apologies, the proposal might not be altogether clear. The first set of figures with the totals of 43,000 and 54,600 are what Maidstone would be funding, and then the figures below are match funding that Kent Wildlife Trust believes that they can source, provided that initial funding is put in by Maidstone Council.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Coates.
Thank you, Chair. Just to understand, it's probably my misunderstanding, not the report. So South East Rivers Trust were set the task of looking at river restoration, but were unable to engage landowners. And so the route going forward is to work with farming clusters. I was just wondering why areas such, I think it's because it's the distinction between the upper and the lower belt, but why were farming clusters like Marden, which have been established for quite a while, not been approached as part of that work? Or is that just my misunderstanding? I assume they, I know Councillor Rodwell has been to visit them recently, so I assume they are being engaged going forward, but I was just trying to understand what went wrong on the first project. And then similarly, just in terms of joined up working and lessons being learned, I'm aware of a natural flood management project that was completed by South East Rivers Trust on the school stream in Headcorn. It was a natural solution with leaky wood structures. It's just whether learnings have been taken from previous projects like that and been linked into this piece of work. Thank you.
I can get back to you on that one, on the learnings. As far as the engagement with the clusters, I've been visiting now the farms. I'm getting to know the differences within the different farms within Marden, and joining the cluster in a few weeks, and I'm meeting another farmer. It's really important, you know, that whatever the lessons learned from the last time, for me, it's about the good thing about the Kent Wildlife Trust is they're sort of the success that they've had in the upper belt. The clusters are quite on board that somebody would come and help facilitate, certainly the Greensand Ridge one. They showed me a mapping tool with all the different clusters that are already signed up, but there's loads and loads that they really want to engage. So, you know, just carrying on meeting and visiting and engaging and ensuring that they own what they want to do on their own land. So, you know, one of the things that the South East River Trust had said was that, you know, the reluctance to engage with the conflict between, you know, the economics and sort of having something happening that, you know, could affect that. And also the lack of funding. Hopefully this will address all of this and, you know, that they will be more on board. But just engage and keep talking and keep listening first, really.
Thank you. Okay, so the recommendation is on page 140. There are 3 aspects to the recommendation, so I'm going to take them all in one go again. So do we agree with the recommendations? Thank you very much. Thank you. So item 16. This is Kent Joint Municipal Waste Management Strategy 25 to 30, and it's going to be introduced by Councillor English, the Cabinet Member for Environmental Services and Enforcement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members. Maidstone Borough Council has been involved in the Kent Waste Partnership for quite a long time, and 2007. And I remember many years ago turning up there as a very junior representative of the Kent Association of Local Councils in the forum as it was in those days. The Waste Partnership was created to ensure that all the disposal and collection authorities were working towards the same set of shared objectives across the county. It is very clearly important that we actually are working together in this particular field rather than trying to cut across ourselves, because that will not be an optimal situation. The strategy you see before you this evening has been the product of input from all of the partner authorities and aims to take account both of some of the challenges and the opportunities that are affecting the waste economy, if you'd like to call it that. There is a lot of legislative and regulatory change taking place. We will see in our own streets fairly soon the changes with simpler recycling, as it's so called. Fortunately, that won't have a huge impact on what we do on the street straight away, because we're more compliant than most authorities. But there are challenges and opportunities in terms of funding streams, and also making sure that in terms of that's an opportunity and a challenge in delivering a move towards a circular economy, which is an objective not just of this council, but of national government to an extent, and certainly of the Waste Partnership. What we see here is a strategy that is, I think, fairly optimistic, but realistic in setting out to meet our challenges. It intends to deliver operational excellence, support a pathway to a circular economy, improve performance through behavioural change, and support all the transition to the unitary management waste, to unitary waste management systems. It is a long document, so I'm sure that people may have questions, which we will attempt to answer. Would you like to add anything, please?
Yes, sorry, so only to add that obviously we've already been on quite a journey through previous strategies, and it's how we got to the Mid-Kent arrangements and the shared services there. It also has helped us deliver some of our, the food waste services and campaigns that we've led by working together and learning from each other across Kent. So I think this just builds upon successes we've already had and looks at making sure that we stay together and working together for that optimum service across Kent. And then whatever the future holds, we'll all be as aligned as possible to move into any new arrangements.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. Are there any comments? Councillor Harper.
I remember it might have been somewhere in the last year there was a discussion that we were going to have to segregate, I think was it paper from cardboard or other recycling, and so everybody would have to have a new bin, so that you would put all your paper and cardboard in one bin and your other recycling in another bin. Now, is that being carried forward, or has the government sort of recognised it wasn't practical?
A lot of work has gone on since, so there is a requirement as part of simpler recycling to have separate paper and card if technically, economically and if efficient to do so. So there's what's called a TPIC assessment that you have to do. This was introduced actually many years ago before it was guided by legislation.
related to targets at the time. So we have, as part of the Kent Resource Partnership, undertaken some work to look at the benefits of, or the implications of simpler recycling, of the deposit return scheme and all of that. Now that will form the basis of our TEEP assessment, because it's very clear that if Maidstone were to go with separate paper and card collections, it would be a higher cost, recycling rates would decrease, and the carbon impact would increase, because it's more lorries on the road, it's less efficient, and people, if they have to separate recycling, generally do it less, so you actually capture less. So there is an ability that, firstly, we're tied into a contract till 2032, and so government have made it very clear that actually if you're tied into arrangements, you don't have to immediately introduce it. So the first change point would be 2032 as part of the new contract. But again, if we have a strong TEEP assessment, which I feel we do not have to introduce separate paper and card collections. So as of simpler recycling, as Councillor English has said, it's no new bins. The collections will say very similar, but what you'll start to see are little other materials appearing in the collections. So Tetra Paks and cartons will come in from April this year, and then they're looking at plastic films from next year. April next year. So those bits, but we're looking at very much keeping the collection regime as it is, just more materials going into it.
Very much for that, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Parfitt.
Apologies, this is not really related, but it's a question I've been meaning to ask for some time, and you're both here. So you know the small lorry that goes down the rural lanes, does that have the ability to separate out rubbish, or is it all going into one? Because obviously I'm observing it and it appears that it all goes into the same.
So we have several different types of lorry that collect narrow roads, but every single one of them has the capacity to collect food separately and should be doing refuse and recycling on alternate weeks. So everything should be collected and go down the different streams. If it's not happening, then I certainly need to know about it, because we have performance mechanisms within the contract that we can issue quite severe deductions to the contractor if they're failing to keep things separate that people are presenting out. The very, very small vehicle, I actually undertook a review probably about 12 months ago now to make changes to that, because there were issues with the recycling and the waste and the food. Now that's the vehicle that looks like a skip. It looks like a tiny little skip on a very small truck body. Now that does have a separate compartment, but at the back you really wouldn't know about it because the bins lift quite high and the compartment is just inside. So if it looks like, as I said, a skip on the back of a lorry and bins go up at the back, there are two compartments. It's really hard to see. So if you see something, send me the registration and I'll look into it. And I can always look on the cameras and they know we're watching. So they generally are pretty good these days.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Jones.
If recycling isn't segregated, would it not show when it gets to the other end that, you know, that there's the wrong items in the wrong lorries?
In theory, but obviously we don't enforce residents for doing it. So actually you can still tip items that might look like recycling in the waste side, or look like, well, unfortunately, some residents still put black bags in the bottom of their recycling bins. So you do get issues. So we monitor contamination really closely, and we work closely with Kent County Council, both at the point where the waste and recycling is taken at Allington, but also where the recycling is then taken up to Crayford. And they will look at, if there's bulk contamination, we will look at that to see and trace it back as how it got in there. And quite often it will be, you know, linked to particular areas that we can then go and door knock and do a little bit of education on of what's going in. But yes, I mean, our food waste, we know food waste is collected separately purely because since the campaign in the last 12 months, our food waste capture has increased by 60%. So we know we're collecting a huge amount of food waste at the moment. It's recovering, not quite to when we launched it back in 2011, when I think 80% of the public, were using the food waste. We do become a bit of a victim of our own success, that where you take so much out of the rubbish bins, people have a bit more space to put other bits in. But yeah, the figures are certainly showing that our recycling is all going in the right direction.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so the recommendation is on page 153. Is to agree the Kent Joint Municipal Waste Management Strategy. Is that agreed? Thank you very much. So last item we got there. Okay, number 17. So bulky waste service changes. This is also going to be introduced by Councillor English, the Cabinet Member for Environmental Services and Enforcement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members. We've from time to time had to make changes to the bulky waste collection service, and we are proposing to make 2 changes at the moment. The first is effectively forced upon us because of the change to the legislative framework and the way that certain materials, POPs, are dealt with, and we have to actually take these now in a segregated way to a segregated disposal site to the north of Sittingbourne, which charges, and therefore we are facing a significant cost, hence the suggestion to charge a small but realistic fee to cover the cost. Otherwise we would essentially be charging people who aren't disposing of the way any items like this to subsidise the people who are. The second issue is, well, I suppose in a way it is also forced on us. What we have is a small but troubling group of people who will persist in booking scheduled slots for bulky waste collections, and I mean a lot of slots, a relatively small number of people, and then cancelling almost all or all of them at the very last moment, which means that people who could have used those slots are not able to do so. And this seems inherently wrong, and it's certainly not a very efficient use of public money or time. So what we are proposing is a very simple mechanism that, as part of the fee, there will be a small non-refundable element, and which you would forfeit if you cancelled. And clearly there would be no impact whatsoever on someone who actually continued to carry out the booking. That they'd simply be paying what they would have done otherwise. But the non-refundable element would cover the issue of people booking slots which they then don't need, and clearly would be a financial disincentive to do this on a large scale, because clearly the money would mount up quite quickly. I think those 2 things speak for themselves. I hope members will support those. I'm quite happy to take questions on those.
Thank you. Councillor Parfitt.
Chairman, well, I certainly support that non-refundable elements, and I think it's actually quite generous, to be honest. In most commercial settings, if you cancel within 48 hours, it's a 50% charge. So I think that's quite generous, and I've used the bulky waste collection and it is brilliant. So yeah, good. So I certainly support that side of it.
Okay. Councillor Jones.
I was just wondering, what's the percentage of cancellations? Just roughly.
So in the past 5 months, it's 10% of bookings are cancelled, which we do quite a lot of collections, so that is quite a number. But yes, we did some particular analysis where there are 25 properties of booked most collections cancelled, a total of 79 bookings made by those small number of collections, and then they're all, I think, 49 were cancelled. So when you look at it, there is people, as I've returned it, it's holding collections in case something comes up. I think they hold collections of bookings, and what we have seen is actually, if you go on now, most people can get a collection within 2 weeks, 3 weeks max. So actually, you don't need to book up far in advance. I think people do it in case something comes up, or if we don't know if people are also running small businesses and collecting things from other people and then booking it, because it's a very cheap way of disposing of that type of waste.
I'd echo what Councillor Parfitt said. I'd do 50%, but perhaps you can think about that in the future. It seems ludicrous that, you know, such a small percentage is costing us such a lot of money.
We will revisit this if it doesn't prove a sufficient disincentive. We might increase it again, but we thought we'd try and be reasonable at this stage.
Yes, I was going to say it is quite strange. It does sound, if it's the same people, I mean, there's only so many times you can get rid of a sofa, isn't there? So, yeah, it does sound like it's a business. Councillor Cannon.
I have cancelled a collection, so but hopefully I'm not. So I just from that point of view, when I was booking, I booked. There wasn't actually something available quite soon. So I think you mentioned 2 to 3 weeks now. Is there still, because basically what happened, I booked something and then we had the internal conversation in our house, get rid of that, and it ended up going to the tip instead. And so I'm just wondering, from the point of view, it does sound sensible. This sort of abuse of the system does sound, it's good to deal with, but can you book quicker if you sort of suddenly have a clear out weekend and you want to try and, or is there still quite a long way?
I don't know how long ago you did that, but we've done a lot of work with Suez on the what's called the polygons around where the postcodes are, because for some reason Wednesdays, which I think is town centre, was always extremely booked up, whereas other areas were less booked. So they've rebalanced everything to do that. They've also introduced Saturday collections now, and those Saturdays are flexible. So they look at where there is a sort of demand and they move it to that area for the next Saturday, so people have that option. So a lot of work has been done which has brought those times right down. And I think we're going to put a lot more information up front to say, really look at if you need this, you know, check if there are other options of taking it to the tip or taking it, you know, looking at charity. So people don't book and then realise there's other options. They do it the other way around.
Councillor Harper.
I mean, on paragraph 2.12, where you say about ME15, which is the town centre, and ME16 is everything in the whole borough west of the Medway. So ME16 is probably one of our biggest areas within the borough. So I'm not that surprised that those two areas are, you know, the highest in terms of booking. It probably is about a third to half the population of the borough.
Didn't go down to look at it per capita, perhaps we should have done, but the figures are what they are.
Thank you. Councillor Jones.
Not specifically to do with this report, but I know a neighbour had some issues getting rid of some pallets actually. And when you looked online, he said that if you were getting rid of wood, it had to be bundled up or something. I don't know. But my question is there flexibility in, you know, if somebody's got something odd to get rid of that it doesn't match your list, what's the process?
My recommendation would be to phone up and speak to the call centre because they're very good. So we do go on items, but we're fairly generous, which is why we say bundled wood, because if you have a piece of wood, well, that's going to be one item because it has to be picked up by and, you know, taken to the vehicle. If you can bundle it, you can get quite a few bits of wood. So for pallets, the same. If you can put a couple, as long as it's safely liftable by 2 people and less than 6 foot long, so it can fit into the sort of vehicle, we will pretty much allow what we allow. So we do allow bundling, but I think if it doesn't quite meet the criteria, because we used to have an other and then everything went under other, I would go to the call centre and they will fit it into a necessary category, or check with us if they're not sure, because occasionally we have like grand pianos and things like that, which always ask the question.
There may be some issues with very old wood if it's been treated with creosote or something like that, because really there are separate regulations that apply to collecting that sort of material, which is technically hazardous. So we might struggle with that, but otherwise we should be okay.
Would think in those circumstances it's best to leave it where it is.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so we have recommendations on page 197. So this is related to the charge. So it's agreeing the introduction of the additional £5 charge per booking, and agreeing the introduction of the £5 non-refundable admin fee within the existing charges to discourage early booking and subsequent cancellation of the service. Is that agreed? Thank you very much. Therefore, I now declare the meeting closed. Thank you very much, everybody.